Chapter 13. Fever. A shape in the dark. A warm pain. It was the wind that woke him. That and the burning ache he felt throughout his body. The wind was howling now, its fingers curling and wrapping around the base of the tree, seeking them greedily. Theron's eyes shot open as the chill set in. He bolted up, his cloak falling to the ground. Rhea had placed it on Theron's shoulders when he was asleep. Both Kit and Rhea had fallen asleep beside him, one under each arm, and now shot awake as well, almost toppling to the floor as Theron stumbled forward. "No. How long have I been asleep?" he said groggily, peering into the darkness, the blur of the trees only barely coming into focus now. "Only a few hours," Rhea responded, standing and hugging herself, protecting herself from the cold in vain. "Few hours." He spun in place to face her, but only saw moving outlines of both of them. The world was spinning for him. He pressed his palm to his forehead, trying to subdue a growing headache. "You were tired," she stepped forward slightly. "You needed rest. We all need it. We need to go." "Right now," he interrupted, his vision refusing to focus. "You're burning up," she said, touching the back of her hand to his face. He pushed it away gently. "I'm fine, my lady." He grabbed her shoulders and stared at her directly. "You need to understand," he said, kneeling. "They will be right behind us now. Whatever lead we had is gone. You should have woken me." He trailed off inside. "Thank you for taking care of me," he said with a nod. "Now we must make haste. Go, both of you, get your things." He kicked snow onto the fire as it hissed out of life and was quickly lost beneath the snow. What little light the embers had provided disappeared, and they were thrust into a world of shadow once more. It had been a nice respite to find sleep, but now that they were moving again, Rhea had little joy in her heart. The very world around them seemed to be pushing down on her. The darkness and the wind were oppressive, and the trees towered over them like giants in the darkness. It was all she could do from breaking into tears. But she couldn't. There would be time for crying when they made it to Portis. She stole a glance at her brother. He was staring at the ground as he walked, his cloak almost too big for him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her and the faintest smile appeared. She wished now she could take back all the times she had taken him for granted or kicked him out of her chambers. He seemed so young and fragile now, and all she wanted more than anything was to make it to Portis and find her parents alive and well. Gods be good, maybe they were. There was a snap of a twig. Theron placed a hand on their backs and forced them down into the snow, their knees buckling. They hit the snow with a soft thud. "Quiet," he whispered to them. Rhea was surrounded by his figure. She could smell the sweat and the must of his armor and leather. There was also the smell of blood and rot. He needed help. Fast. She watched his hand go to a dagger at his belt. It slid out of the sheath soundlessly. She saw him mutter something under his breath and reach into a small pouch at his side. He withdrew a small red stone glowing faintly under his touch. He pressed the stone to his chest, and she saw the same glow now in his eyes. He seemed to relax, scanning the darkness. Even as a non-mage, she recognized this as a dark vision spell. "Stay here and stay down," he muttered to her. Before she could say anything else, he rose from the ground and walked away into the shadows. "Rhea, I'm scared," Kit whispered, his voice shaking. "It's okay. Theron will protect us," Rhea said. But she couldn't look at him. Her eyes were darting around wildly, helplessly, looking for any trace of Theron. "He'll be back. He'll be back." The wind howled around them, and time seemed to slow to a crawl with no other sound breaking the darkness. It was almost claustrophobic the way the world seemed to envelop them now that Theron was gone. What if he never came back? She couldn't help but let the oppressive thoughts in. The silhouettes of the trees felt like living creatures, carrion of earth that watched them, waiting for them to die. The sound of the night was broken by the sound of thuds. Rhea's ears perked up as she recognized it now as the faint sound of struggling. Oh no. She rounded on Kit, placing her hands on his shoulders in much the same way Theron had done to her. "Listen to me. Theron is in trouble. You have to stay right here. You hear me? Don't move," she ordered. Kit began to cry, but there was no time. She hurried off in the direction of the fight. There was a blinding arc that split the darkness like a javelin of blue light. It illuminated the mounds of snow around her, and for a split moment the forest didn't feel so scary. The air smelled ionized, and her skin tingled as she turned the corner just in time to see Theron ducking behind a tree. His arm was blackened as if burned, and he was clearly in pain. As Theron's back hit the trees, his eyes went up and spotted her. Then his eyes went wide in fear. "No," he called out, his voice echoing. Her eyes caught the slightest movement behind another tree only a few yards away from where Theron was hiding. She saw the masked and hooded figure there. She saw the shine of the black leather armor beneath the cloak. Then she saw the bow, and the faintest glint of the head of an arrow. Once again, time slowed. Theron leapt from his position and dashed towards her. There was the unmistakable thwip and twang of an arrow flying from its string. She sighed, her body going cold and numb as fear set in within a fraction of a second. She'd made a mistake coming here thinking she could help. She closed her eyes. The last thing she saw was Theron's figure flying through the air at her. His scream echoed off the mountains and reverberated through the trunks that surrounded them. She could hear her heartbeat in her head. When she opened her eyes, she was on her back, staring at a patch of stars that had broken through the clouds. From here, the trees weren't monsters. No. They were arrows. They were guides. She mustered the strength to move, turning her head in time to see Theron with blade in hand lunging at the masked figure. Theron's blade cut through the air, a flaming light guiding it. There was a resounding boom as his blade connected. The masked figure reacted in moments, their arms outstretched before them, an invisible barrier warbling as the flame on Theron's sword suddenly disappeared. How had they been so quick? Rhea stared in awe at Theron's speed and strength. She tried to picture him in his youth without the stubble and concern that covered it now. She imagined him happier, smiling and untroubled. Another strike of light pulled her out of it as Theron was flung backwards. She heard his body hit snow and stone and his grunt of pain as the wind was knocked out of it. The masked figure stood before both of them now, and she could hear the cold, deep laugh. She took a deep breath to sit up, but as she breathed in, a searing pain took her. Fire and lightning moved through her body in a flash, a heat that radiated from her abdomen. She mustered what strength she could after their grueling trek and looked down. That's when she saw the unmistakable shaft of a hastily made arrow and black feathers tied with golden string. She was dying. She began to weep as the adrenaline subsided and pain took her. "Theron!" she cried out. The man stepped towards Theron, who was still out of sight for Rhea, though she could hear his labored breathing. Was this it? 8 of Rain's finest for an Alaran brat and a traitor. The man clicked his teeth as he stepped towards Rhea. And this is the demon's sister, then? The figure moved towards Rhea, each of his steps creating a sickening crunch as he moved through the snow. Rhea tried to move, but every tiny movement of her muscles sent white-hot pain through her. "Theron!" she cried out again. The figure stopped hovering over her, looking down on her. He placed his hands on his knees and crouched over her like a child watching an insect. "Get away from her," Theron said, rising. She heard the sound of Theron pulling a dagger from his belt. "It's over, Theron, son of Rain. Kneel and die honorably. There's no need to be hanged, a traitor." The figure stood up straight once more and turned his attention to Theron. "I said, get away from her." Theron stumbled, smoke rising from his clothing, the smell of lightning still clinging to the air around him. "Please, brother." "Brother, is it now?" The figure laughed. "You killed your brothers for these two," he pointed at Rhea. "You lost your brothers the moment you ran into the darkness. You make me sick." He spat on the ground. "They lied to us," Theron managed. "This whole time, I I've seen them. I've watched them. These kids, they're not demons. They're not sick. They just want to go home. And I'll send them home, Theron. In a box. The figure raised an arm, blade in hand. Rhea counted the seconds. She closed her eyes, the world moving slowly. She felt the snow. She felt the aching cold and the warm blood pooling on her back. She heard the rustling of leaves and tasted the air one last time. It was so beautiful. Her final thoughts were of her brother. She wished she could see him grow up to become a man, to become a mage. Now she wondered if he'd ever grow up at all. But no blow came. There was a thwump sound as an arrow struck flesh. She thought it was her for a moment until she opened her eyes. The figure stood there, frozen. He dropped the sword and turned, an arrow in his back. In the shadows amongst the trees, a figure emerged. Rhea turned her head to look at Theron, who, with one last sigh, fell to his knees in the snow. He was heaving, his breathing labored, but he was alive. Theron looked up at the figure emerging from the trees with a small smile. Mira,